So I don't know, that's sweet and delicious and comforting and warming. And I'm looking forward to probably polishing the bottle off myself, because recently my wife doesn't really like red wine. So that's excellent. Are you just Italian with a very good Scottish accent, or are you Scottish with a very good Italian accent?
I'm actually first generation Italian in the sense, Scottish in the sense that my father was born actually on the farm in which this grape comes from. And I always had a hankering to do something about it. So when I found myself with some savings and not a lot of confidence in some advisors here, not that any of them were bad, they were all great. It's just that the market had collapsed, and I had nothing to do. I found myself back in Italy, back on collecting bits of land to put this farm back together again, because it had been abandoned over 100 years ago. And then slowly started to work out that I was taking on something a bit bigger than I thought I should take on. But having started, I couldn't stop. And I thought, well, what I'm going to do is, if this is about touching the past, then I've actually got to do it properly. I've got to accept that this land had always been used for growing grapes. What was the grape? The locals told me it was this grape called Maturano. This is a tiny village, by the way. The centre of the village is 100 people, and the territory round about the village, controlled by the village council, which is the second biggest council area in Lazio, has only 1,000 people. So we're talking of a tiny place. Are great gossipers. So I said, well, to avoid gossip, I'm going to go and take cuttings from the locals who talked to me about this Maturano, and we'll get that reproduced and we'll plant that. I first had to acquire over 220 bits of land from over 140 different people.
Oh, wow. Well, that can't have been easy, because knowing how fond people are of keeping their land, well, farmers everywhere, I guess.
They were all very distant relatives from my brothers and sisters through to 6 generations of separation. So it was quite a big job, as I say. Having done that, I then had to clean the land. We put drainage in, and then we had to plant, and then we had to wait until 2017 to have our first vintage.
I think actually what probably a lot of people don't realise is if you start a vineyard from scratch, you've got to clear the land, you plant saplings or whatever you call them, cuttings. It's minimum 5-6 years before you get a first drop, isn't it?
These are 5 years.
Okay, and that's a long time to wait before you get any money back from selling the wine.
It's a long time. So I didn't know any of that, but just cracked on as usual. We cleared about 4 hectares, which is about 10 acres. The land sits, yes, it's in Lazio, but it actually sits on the Apennine slopes, on the edge of the Abruzzo. So the province of Abruzzo is literally 1.5 kilometers away.
One of the things I learnt when I was doing all my wine exams is that temperature is vitally important for grape growing. So for white wines, the cooler for some white wines, if it's too hot, they can't grow as well. They lose their freshness and their elegance the hotter it goes. So the further for us in Europe, the further south you go, the hotter it gets, the less elegant the white wines are, and the more you go towards red wines. However, for every 200 meters up, higher altitude you go, it's the equivalent of going 1 degree further north in temperature. So if you've got a high altitude in what people consider to be a hot region, you can still make you can still have cool climate wines.
Well, in fact, as I say, this sits at about 600 meters, really, below a mountain, which is the only mountain in Italy from which you can see the Adriatic and the Mediterranean coasts, seas. My brother-in-law in Edinburgh introduced me to a winemaker because I wanted someone out of the area, and he introduced me to a man called Alberto Antonini.
Oh yes, I've heard about him.
Who had previously worked for Frescobaldi, for Antinori, for Allegrini, for others, and was a consultant. In fact, some call him a flying winemaker, but he refuses to accept that title. And in fact, we're pleased to say that he insisted we simply write our friend Alberto Antonini on our label, which is a real privilege. He was named in 2015 by coincidence, as by decanter in a survey of his peers, one of the top 5 winemakers in the world. So we're very privileged to have this man who lives in natural wines. He lives in a space which is fairly natural.
Wines are organic, aren't they?
Our wines are organic. The ground is organic. This is not certified organic simply because the winemaking facility wasn't certified at the time. It is now certified. But it makes no difference. So having planted the grapes, we then got to we got to 2016 and found that the few grapes we had all been eaten by wild boars. We're actually in a national park.
Okay.
So we get to 2017, we're ready to pick, and we find that 2 very different grapes have come out. And of course, I get a bit angry because the grower who had taken our cuttings to replicate them should have done his job. But the locals kept on telling me these are both Maturano grapes, and they call them masculine and feminine. So of course, being a bit huffy, a grumpy old man, I found somebody who could send them off to one of the leading laboratories in Europe, in France. And after 3 months, I got the results back. And the results said that these were, having done the test twice because they didn't believe them the first time, these grapes had identical DNA, despite seeming to be very different, and were unique and had no parentage. So they were ancient grapes that had never been identified before, grown on ground which was abandoned, and therefore we can be absolutely sure that chemicals were never used on it, which it turns out from other research I'd done from the church records that my family had looked after for over 500 years, because we can take it back to 1490 as a family tree, but not nobles. We're talking about simple farm workers, but it always lived there, and a tradition associated with that. So you can imagine lots of time, lots of capital, lots of energy, lots of worry, lots of support, and it gets a bit nervous when you're making your first wine. We left this wine sitting for 4 days on the skins in a steel tank without pressing, really to macerate the grapes, really just allow them to settle and to allow some of the flavors from the skins to get into the wine. I can share a screen here because I've got somewhere. So these are Maturano grapes.
So those are the grapes there. So are they particular? I mean, the colour is beautiful. I love the colour of it. I mean, to the extent, to the point that today most white wines are much lighter in colour. So when you see one with that depth of colour, you almost feel a bit suspicious, and you're wondering if it's going to be oxidised or something like that.
There's a bit of I think it's a little oxygenated, but I think that's part of the character.
Yeah, but in a positive way. It's not going brown. It's going. The colour is a beautiful. It's a vibrant gold colour. I love it. The first thing we noticed when we opened the bottle was how beautiful the colour.
The curious thing, Mark, is that we made this because this was an old wine, but nobody had ever made it commercially before. So we're taking very much the advice of Alberto, and we're also experimenting in various ways. So one of the experiments we did was to take this wine, which was really 3 days without pressing, then pressed with the skins discarded.
Yeah.
This then was matured within a temperature-controlled environment for 4 months.
Okay.
We actually lost In fact, perhaps a bit longer than that, because the fermentation stopped and it started again in the springtime. We let that finish, let it settle, we racked it off, and by that I mean we simply took off the dead yeast cells and the lees, as they call them, lying in the bottom of the tank, and did that 2 or 3 times. We then bottled in September 2018, and we felt it was ready to start drinking around about March 2019. We think it's going to continue to improve, and the reason for that is twofold. Apart from the comments of Alberto, the historic evidence of a sort of doomsday book from the 15th century says that the best white wines of the area come from Pigenisco, which is the town this come from, and are even more divine after a year.
We might need to wrap up, but I think this is the first vintage that, again, I'm guessing you've made, so you don't have any sort of any museum stock to know how it's going to finish, but I would predict that this will age really well. I've got a feeling that this has got quite a few years in it, and I may well put a few cases down and just keep going back to them year after year, every time in 6 months. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cesidio. It's been great to listen to your stuff.
Thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you, Mark. Enjoy.
Thanks, Cesidio. Bye.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.